By 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic was being lost, not because the Allies lacked ships, courage, or industry, but because they lacked a reliable way to kill submarines once contact was made. Convoys could detect U-boats, they could force them to dive, they could even chase them. What they could not do consistently was destroy them. That failure shaped everything that followed. Anti-submarine warfare at the start of the war relied on a paradox. The primary weapon, the depth charge, was only effective if detonated near a submerged submarine. But to drop depth charges, an escort ship had to pass directly over the target. The moment the ship crossed above the submarine, sonar contact was lost. Crews were forced to guess where the U-boat would be seconds later, set depth charges accordingly, and hope the explosion landed close enough to crush the hull. Most of the time, it did not. This created a deadly rhythm. Escorts would detect a U-boat, drive it under, lose contact, attack blindly, then circle back to reacquire. Each pass gave the submarine time to maneuver, change depth, or slip away entirely. Even when depth charges exploded close enough to cause damage, they often failed to kill. Cracked hull fittings could be patched, systems could be jury-rigged, crews could survive, the U-boat would limp away, repair, and return to the hunt. German submariners understood this weakness perfectly. Diving was not surrender, it was survival. Once submerged, a U-boat was often safer than on the surface. Depth charges were terrifying, but they were imprecise. Survival depended on discipline, silence, and patience, and German crews had all three. For Allied escorts, the experience was infuriating. Convoys were attacked, ships were sunk. U-boats were chased for hours or days, only to escape. The ratio was unsustainable. Escorts expended fuel, time, and ammunition for results that were often inconclusive. The ocean favored the hunter who could disengage at will. This imbalance defined the early Atlantic War. Doctrine did not help. Anti-submarine tactics were built around deterrence rather than destruction. The goal was often to force submarines away from convoys, not necessarily to kill them. This made sense when escorts were scarce and the priority was protection. But it meant the U-boat fleet remained intact. Each submarine driven off today returned tomorrow. German commanders exploited this. Wolf packs shadowed convoys, waited for escorts to exhaust themselves, then attacked again. The ocean was vast, escorts were limited, and submarines needed only one success per patrol to justify their existence. The technological gap widened the problem. Sonar, known then as ASDIC, could detect submarines under ideal conditions, but it struggled in rough seas, thermal layers, and cluttered environments. Contact quality varied. Range estimates were imperfect. Bearings drifted. Every uncertainty multiplied the difficulty of delivering a lethal attack. Depth charges, meanwhile, were blunt instruments. They damaged through pressure, not precision. Setting them too shallow missed deep-diving submarines. Setting them too deep allowed submarines to pass beneath the blast radius. Even perfect estimates could be undermined by evasive maneuvers executed seconds before detonation. The result was a war of attrition the Allies were losing. Merchant losses mounted. Escort crews grew exhausted. Commanders knew submarines were present but lacked confidence they could destroy them once found. Morale suffered quietly, not from fear, but from futility. German morale, by contrast, remained strong. Submarine crews believed, correctly, that if they were detected early enough, survival odds were good. The ocean gave them room, Allied weapons gave them time. This is why early ASW failures cannot be understood as simple incompetence. The system itself was flawed, detection and destruction were disconnected. A weapon that required loss of contact at the moment of attack was fundamentally misaligned with the nature of submarine warfare. What was needed was obvious in hindsight, but radical at the time. A way to attack a submarine without losing sonar contact. That idea met resistance. Naval tradition favored heavy explosives and proven methods. New concepts were viewed with skepticism. Complex solutions were mistrusted at sea. Anything that relied on multiple projectiles, precise timing, or unfamiliar mechanics was assumed to be unreliable under combat conditions. Depth charges were simple. Crews understood them. Officers trusted them. Changing that required not just new technology, but a shift in mindset, from area destruction to precision engagement. Until that shift occurred, the Atlantic remained a hunting ground for submarines. Convoys sailed knowing escorts could chase, harass, and deter, but not reliably kill. That reality shaped strategy, shipbuilding priorities, and even diplomatic pressure between allied nations desperate for a solution that would finally turn contact into destruction. The answer would not come from larger explosions or deeper charges. It would come from accepting a simple truth. You cannot kill what you stop tracking. The idea behind HEDGEHOG challenged nearly every assumption naval officers held about how submarines should be killed. For decades, anti-submarine warfare had relied on shock and saturation. The solution to uncertainty had always been more explosive power delivered over a wider area. HEDGEHOG proposed the opposite. It offered less explosive force, concentrated into multiple small projectiles, and demanded accuracy instead of intimidation. To many experienced officers, this felt like regression rather than progress. Skepticism was immediate and widespread. Depth charges were brutal, simple, and familiar. HEDGEHOG looked complicated. It launched dozens of small bombs ahead of the ship, rather than dropping a few large charges behind it. Each projectile detonated only on contact. There was no concussive blast pattern. No towering columns of water, no reassuring confirmation that something had happened beneath the surface. To crews accustomed to judging success by violence, HEDGEHOG appeared underwhelming. The resistance was not irrational. Sea combat punished complexity. Mechanical failures were common. Weather interfered with precision. Sonar readings fluctuated. Officers worried that a weapon requiring accurate tracking, timing, and alignment would fail under combat stress. A depth charge might miss, but at least it exploded. HEDGEHOG might miss and do nothing at all. There was also a psychological dimension. Depth charges produced visible results. Explosions reassured crews that they were fighting back. HEDGEHOG, when it missed, was silent. No explosions meant no feedback. Silence in the chaos of convoy escort duty felt like failure. Crews wanted confirmation. Commanders wanted certainty. HEDGEHOG offered neither unless it hit. This discomfort extended up the chain of command. Naval institutions value tradition, especially in wartime. HEDGEHOG represented a doctrinal shift from deterrence to destruction, from area denial to precision kill. Adopting it required admitting that existing methods were insufficient. That admission came slowly. The technical concept, however, was elegant. HEDGEHOG launched a pattern of spigot-fired projectiles in an elliptical spread ahead of the ship. Because the weapon fired forward, the escort could maintain sonar contact throughout the attack run. There was no blind moment. The submarine's position could be tracked continuously until impact. This alone addressed the central flaw of depth charge attacks. Equally important was the detonation mechanism. HEDGEHOG charges exploded only on contact with a solid object. If they missed, they sank harmlessly. This eliminated the noise and turbulence that disrupted sonar during depth charge attacks. If HEDGEHOG failed to hit, contact was often retained, allowing immediate reattack. In theory, this turned pursuit into pressure rather than a cycle of chase and escape. In practice, the theory was met with doubt. Early trials produced mixed results. Crews unfamiliar with the weapon struggled to judge timing and range. Training was limited. Some attacks failed because sonar data was misinterpreted. When HEDGEHOG missed, nothing happened. No explosion meant no morale boost, no visible feedback. Reports described attacks as unsatisfactory or inconclusive, not because submarines escaped, but because crews felt they had accomplished nothing. This reaction delayed adoption. HEDGEHOG was available before its impact was felt. Ships equipped with it often continued to rely on depth charges out of habit. Some commanders treated HEDGEHOG as a supplementary tool rather than a primary weapon. It took time and evidence to change that behavior. Evidence arrived gradually, and then all at once. When HEDGEHOG hit, the result was unmistakable. Contact detonation produced immediate, lethal damage. Submarines struck by multiple projectiles did not limp away. They broke, wreckage surfaced, oil slicks appeared, debris floated. For the first time, escorts could confirm kills with confidence rather than inference. More importantly, the pattern of engagement changed. Submarines attacked by HEDGEHOG had fewer opportunities to escape. Continuous sonar contact denied them the breathing space they relied on. Maneuvering underwater became riskier. Evasive turns could move a submarine directly into the projectile pattern rather than away from it. German crews noticed the difference quickly. Reports from U-boat commanders began to describe attacks that felt different: shorter, sharper, more dangerous. The absence of thunderous explosions was replaced by sudden, catastrophic hits. Survivability declined, escape rates dropped. The shift was subtle at first. HEDGEHOG did not instantly end the U-boat threat, but it altered the calculus. For the first time, detection reliably led to destruction. The ocean stopped being a place where submarines could disengage at will once found. Contact became pressure. Pressure became attrition. This exposed another advantage that critics had underestimated. HEDGEHOG rewarded skill. Crews who trained with it improved rapidly. Sonar operators refined tracking techniques. Bridge crews coordinated speed and heading more precisely. Attacks became more disciplined. Where depth charges relied on probability, HEDGEHOG relied on process. As confidence grew, doctrine began to change. Escorts were encouraged to maintain contact aggressively rather than drive submarines away. The objective shifted decisively toward killing rather than deterring. This mattered because it attacked the U-boat force itself, not just its immediate threat to a convoy. Resistance within the fleet did not disappear overnight. Some officers never fully trusted the weapon, others used it reluctantly. But the results spoke louder than tradition. Escort groups that embraced HEDGEHOG achieved higher kill rates. Submarines engaged were less likely to escape. Patrol durations shortened. Losses mounted on the German side. The weapon's critics also underestimated its psychological impact on the enemy. U-boat crews had trained to survive depth charge attacks. They had drills, expectations, and confidence built around them. HEDGEHOG disrupted that mental model. Silence no longer meant safety. The absence of explosions no longer signaled survival. Uncertainty replaced familiarity. That uncertainty eroded morale. Submarine warfare relies on confidence as much as stealth. When crews believe detection equals likely destruction, behavior changes. Risk tolerance drops. Aggression declines. Patrols become cautious. Effectiveness suffers. HEDGEHOG was not perfect. It required accurate sonar. It demanded training. It did not guarantee a hit. But it addressed the core flaw that had defined early ASW failures. It kept contact at the moment of attack. Everything else flowed from that correction. What had been mocked as underpowered and unreliable proved to be precisely what the Atlantic War required. Not bigger explosions, but better alignment between detection and destruction. The Atlantic did not change overnight when HEDGEHOG entered service. There was no single week when sinking stopped or convoys suddenly sailed untouched. What changed was the direction of the war beneath the surface. For the first time, the balance between detection and destruction aligned, and that alignment produced effects that compounded relentlessly. The critical shift was procedural rather than dramatic. Escort commanders began to treat sonar contact as an opportunity rather than a warning. With depth charges, contact triggered a chase that often ended in uncertainty. With HEDGEHOG, contact initiated a sequence that could be repeated without interruption. Escorts no longer had to choose between maintaining track and delivering a lethal attack. They could do both continuously. This changed how attacks were flown in, literally and figuratively. Escorts approached at controlled speed, maintaining steady sonar contact. Bridge and sonar crews worked as a single system, refining bearings and range estimates in real time. Instead of racing to drop charges and hope for the best, ships maneuvered to place the submarine inside the forward firing pattern with precision. The effect on submarine survivability was immediate. U-boats relied on brief windows, moments when sonar contact was lost, to execute evasive maneuvers. HEDGEHOG closed those windows. Every second the escort remained on top of the target increased the likelihood of contact detonation. Maneuvers that once increased survival now increased risk. Turning sharply could place the hull directly beneath the projectile spread. Diving deeper did not help. Speed changes did not help. Silence no longer bought time. Equally important was what did not happen. When HEDGEHOG missed, there was no explosion to obscure sonar, no boiling water, no acoustic chaos. Contact was often retained, allowing immediate reattack. This transformed ASW from episodic violence into sustained pressure. Submarines were forced to endure repeated attack runs without respite. Fatigue mounted. Errors multiplied. Survival odds fell. The cumulative effect reshaped escort tactics. Kill probability increased not because HEDGEHOG was magically lethal, but because it allowed persistence. Escorts could attack again and again without breaking contact. Each pass refined the solution. The submarine's options narrowed with every minute spent under pressure. German commanders began to notice patterns they had not seen before. Patrol reports increasingly described encounters that ended decisively rather than ambiguously. Submarines failed to return. Radio traffic thinned. Where earlier losses were sporadic and explainable, they now clustered around convoy routes that had been reinforced with improved escorts and new weapons. This shift coincided with broader changes: better convoy routing, increased air cover, improved intelligence. But HEDGEHOG played a specific role within that system. It converted information into outcomes. Detection alone had never been enough. HEDGEHOG made detection actionable. The psychological consequences were profound. U-boat crews had learned to measure danger by sound. The thunder of depth charges was terrifying, but it was also familiar. It followed patterns. Crews knew when the danger window opened and when it closed. HEDGEHOG erased those cues. Silence became ambiguous. The absence of explosions no longer meant safety. It meant the escort still knew exactly where you were. This uncertainty altered behavior. Submarines became more cautious. Aggressive shadowing declined. Attacks were delayed or abandoned. Time on station shortened. The Wolfpack concept, already strained by Allied countermeasures, lost effectiveness when individual boats could no longer approach with confidence. On the Allied side, confidence rose. Crews who had spent months chasing submarines that escaped now saw tangible results. Oil slicks, debris, and confirmed kills replaced guesswork. Morale improved not because the work became easier, but because it finally felt decisive. Effort produced outcomes. Doctrine followed results. HEDGEHOG moved from novelty to standard practice. Training emphasized precision, coordination, and patience. Escorts were encouraged to press attacks rather than disengage after initial contact. The objective was no longer to scare submarines away, but to remove them from the ocean. This doctrinal shift mattered strategically. Submarine warfare depends on numbers and persistence. Each U-boat lost reduced coverage, disrupted patrol patterns, and strained German command and logistics. Unlike Allied shipbuilding, German submarine production could not compensate indefinitely for experienced crews lost at sea. Training pipelines were finite, losses accumulated. As Hedgehog-equipped escorts multiplied, the attritional curve bent. Sinkings of merchant ships declined, not because U-boats vanished instantly, but because the risk-reward balance turned against them. Each patrol became more dangerous. Each contact carried a higher probability of destruction. Survival was no longer the default outcome of detection. German attempts to adapt lagged behind reality. Countermeasures focused on deeper dives, quieter running, and evasive tactics that had worked against depth charges. They worked less well against a weapon that punished precisely those behaviors. Technological responses could not restore the lost alignment between stealth and survival. The Atlantic began to favor the defender of convoys rather than the hunter beneath them. This did not eliminate danger. Submarines remained lethal. Losses continued. But the trend was unmistakable. Where escorts once struggled to kill, they now hunted with increasing effectiveness. Hedgehog's influence also extended beyond individual engagements. It allowed escort groups to clear areas rather than merely disrupt them. Submarine-free corridors emerged, improving convoy throughput and reducing strain on shipping schedules. Logistics stabilized. The war's economic underpinnings strengthened. This mattered because the Battle of the Atlantic was never just a tactical contest. It was an industrial and logistical war fought at sea. Weapons that increased kill rates had effects far beyond the immediate engagement. They protected tonnage, preserved fuel, and sustained momentum across theaters. Hedgehog did not win the Atlantic alone, but it solved a problem that had resisted every incremental fix before it. It closed the gap between knowing and killing. Once that gap closed, other improvements could compound rather than dissipate. The irony is that Hedgehog's defining feature, its restraint, was what made it lethal. Smaller charges, no blast unless contact occurred, no spectacle, precision over intimidation. In a war dominated by scale, the weapon that turned the tide beneath the waves was one that demanded discipline and rewarded accuracy. By the time German command fully appreciated the change, the damage was already systemic. Submarines were not just being challenged, they were being removed faster than they could be replaced. The Atlantic was no longer a place of calculated risk. It was becoming a place of attrition the U-boat arm could not survive. Hedgehog's true power became clear only when it was no longer treated as a standalone invention, but as a component inside a rapidly evolving anti-submarine system. Weapons rarely decide wars by themselves. Systems do. By the time Hedgehog was widely deployed, the Atlantic had become a laboratory in which detection, tracking, communication, and attack were being fused into a single continuous process. Hedgehog was the keystone that made that fusion lethal. The defining feature of this system was continuity. Earlier ASW efforts had been episodic. Contact was made, lost, regained, then lost again. Each break favored the submarine. The emerging Allied system aimed to eliminate breaks entirely. Sonar improvements extended reliable tracking. Radio coordination between escorts allowed contacts to be handed off rather than abandoned. Air patrols narrowed escape routes. Hedgehog ensured that when a ship reached the final phase, attack, it did not have to sacrifice tracking to deliver force. This alignment changed escort behavior fundamentally. Instead of operating as isolated defenders, ships began to function as coordinated hunting groups. One escort could hold contact while another maneuvered for attack. Hedgehog's forward-throwing design made this cooperation practical. Attacks no longer disrupted the wider screen. Pressure was maintained across the contact zone. Air power amplified this effect. Long-range patrol aircraft closed the air gap that U-boats had exploited earlier in the war. Submarines forced to dive early by aircraft entered the escort envelope already disadvantaged. Hedgehog attacks then denied them the ability to reset once submerged. What had once been a sequence of disconnected threats became a layered trap. Intelligence also tightened the system. Signals intelligence and improved routing reduced the randomness of convoy encounters. Escorts were no longer reacting blindly. They were being placed where submarines were likely to be. This meant hedgehog attacks were not rare opportunities but recurring events. Each patrol carried multiple risks rather than isolated moments of danger. From the German perspective, this convergence was devastating. U-boat doctrine depended on disengagement. A submarine that survived an encounter could still threaten shipping later. Hedgehog and the system around it undermined that assumption. Survival itself became uncertain. Damage that once would have been repairable now resulted in loss. Crews disappeared without explanation. Patrol reports ended abruptly. German command attempted to respond by dispersing operations and emphasizing caution, but caution reduced effectiveness. Submarines that avoided risk also avoided success. Patrol durations shortened. Contact opportunities declined. The economics of submarine warfare began to turn against Germany. Each boat required months to build and train. Each loss was permanent. Each surviving patrol achieved less. The Atlantic's character changed accordingly. Convoys no longer sailed as prey, hoping to outrun hunters. They moved as defended systems. Escorts were no longer passive shields. They were active predators. Hedgehog attacks became a symbol of this reversal. Quiet, precise, and decisive, they marked the point where the hunter had become the hunted. Importantly, Hedgehog did not rely on overwhelming firepower. It relied on discipline. Crews had to trust sonar data. Commanders had to resist the urge to rush attacks. Training emphasized patience and coordination. This culture shift mattered as much as the hardware. Where early ASW doctrine prized aggression without precision, the new system prized control. This shift also reduced wasted effort. Depth charge attacks consumed time, fuel, and ammunition with uncertain results. Hedgehog attacks, when executed properly, resolved contacts more quickly. Escorts could return to convoy duty sooner. Coverage improved. The system became more efficient as well as more lethal. By late 1943 and into 1944, the results were undeniable. U-boat losses rose sharply. Merchant losses fell. The balance of attrition reversed. Germany could no longer hope to outproduce or outfight the Allied ASW system. Each innovation layered atop Hedgehog, improved sonar, better coordination, air cover, made the environment more hostile to submarines. Crucially, the Atlantic never reverted. Once the system matured, there was no return to the earlier era of uncertainty. U-boats continued to operate, but they did so in an environment that punished mistakes relentlessly. Even experienced crews found survival increasingly difficult. New crews fared worse. This permanence distinguishes Hedgehog's impact from earlier turning points. It did not create a temporary advantage. It locked one in. The Atlantic became a controlled space rather than a contested one. Logistics flowed with increasing reliability. Industrial power could be applied without constant interruption. Strategic momentum accelerated across every theater that depended on maritime supply. Hedgehog's legacy lies in this systemic effect. It represents the moment when ASW stopped being reactive and became proactive. The ocean ceased to be neutral ground. It became an environment shaped deliberately by Allied technology, doctrine, and coordination. The irony remains that Hedgehog achieved this without spectacle. No towering plumes of water, no thunderous detonations unless contact was made. Silence became the sound of success. Precision replaced intimidation. Control replaced chaos. By the time German command fully grasped the implications, it was too late. Submarines were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Crews could not be trained fast enough. The Atlantic, once Germany's best hope for strangling Britain and disrupting Allied industry, had flipped permanently. Hedgehog's importance does not end with the Battle of the Atlantic. Its real legacy lies in how it permanently changed the logic of anti-submarine warfare. Before Hedgehog, navies treated submarines as threats to be deterred, driven away, or survived. After Hedgehog, submarines were treated as targets to be destroyed once detected. That change in intent reshaped doctrine long after World War II ended. The key lesson Hedgehog taught was brutally simple. Detection without continuous engagement is meaningless. For decades, naval thinking had accepted gaps in contact as unavoidable. Hedgehog proved they were not. By allowing escorts to attack while maintaining sonar contact, it demonstrated that submarine warfare could be reduced from a guessing game to a process. Once that process existed, it could be refined, scaled, and improved. Every post-war ASW system is built on this logic. Later weapons replaced Hedgehog's mechanics, but not its philosophy. Squid and Limbo mortars increased explosive power and accuracy, but retained the forward-throwing, contact-focused concept. Homing torpedoes extended the idea further, turning the weapon itself into a tracking system. Modern ASW platforms, ships, helicopters, and aircraft still prioritize continuous contact through sonar, magnetic detection, and acoustic processing before committing to attack. The through line is unmistakable. Hedgehog shifted ASW from area punishment to precision engagement. That shift made submarine survivability dependent on avoiding detection entirely, not merely enduring attack. This raised the skill threshold for submariners and compressed their margin for error. For submarines, this was a permanent setback. Once ASW became systemic, submarines could no longer rely on the ocean alone for protection. Every technological advance in stealth had to be matched by advances in detection and engagement. The contest became dynamic, but Hedgehog ensured it.